Hi, I'm the Adventist Watchman. In today's video, we're going to study how do Adventists determine, or what do we use to determine when the 2300-day prophecy began. Are you ready? Let's study. By now you should understand that the cleansing of sin from the heavenly sanctuary actually involves removal of the record of sin in heaven. And now that we understand what is being cleansed during the cleansing of the sanctuary at the end of the 2300 days, now we need to determine when is the 2300 days. In essence, we need to confirm when the 2300 days began, and we need to understand when the 2300 days ended. So what we're doing right now is we're going to create a series within the series. Okay, so we're still studying the sanctuary, but I'm going to segment a few studies out of this study. I'm going to segment it just referencing or just focusing on the timing of the 2300 days, when it began and when it ended. Okay, and so in this group of studies, we're going to talk about everything that you're going to need to know. We're going to talk about the barley harvest. We're going to talk about 1844. Was it September or was it October? We're going to talk about the 70-week prophecy. We're going to talk about the spring equinox, right? We're going to talk about everything that has been determined or that has been mentioned as beginning this and ending this 2300-day prophecy. So we're going to talk. So everything that you're going to need to learn about the starting and the ending of the 2300-day prophecy, you're going to learn it here. Okay. And I can almost guarantee you're going to learn some things and understand some things that you probably have never even heard of before, but you're going to hear it here. Okay. So just stay tuned. I want you to subscribe to this channel and like this video and actually share this video as well, because we're going to give some information that I think that you'll be pleasantly surprised with. Okay. Now, in today's study, we're not gonna get into all of that here, but in today's study, we have one focus on today's study, and that is, what do Adventists use to determine the beginning of the calculation of the 2300-day prophecy? In other words, in this study, we're not going to calculate the 2300-day prophecy, but what do we use to determine what we're calculating? How do we start it off? What is it that we're using? Okay. And we're going to focus on that study today. So I hope that you are ready. I hope you got your Bibles. Let's go into our key text. Our key text is Daniel 8:14. We're going to do it almost every study for this whole series, and you should know by heart. The Bible says in Daniel 8:14, it says, "And he said unto me, unto 2300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." Now, just as an aside, just as a refresher, remember, evangelicals and Catholics, they teach that the 2300-day prophecy is not a day prophecy. It's actually 2300 sacrifices. Okay. Now, we've actually focused a little bit on that concept, and we've talked about it in a previous study. And if you'd like to look at that study, the whole study is not on this 2300-day sacrifice, but we definitely go into this 2300 false prophecy of 2300 sacrifices. And if you want to look at that video, just go here, and that should give you the video that we talked about, this 2300 sacrifice prophecy that is believed by evangelicals and Catholics. Now, we're going to briefly discuss this 2300 sacrifice prophecy in this video, but I'm not going to go into details. All right. The 2300 sacrifice prophecy it's almost impossible. It is impossible that the 2300-day prophecy is a 2300 sacrifice prophecy. Okay. And I'm going to share with you why that is the case right now. Although, now we understand that in the Bible, the evening and morning is Areb Boker. They're both singular. So it is 2300 evening, morning. Okay. Now we understand that because they're both singular. So it's a 2300 evening, morning unit. Okay. So Each evening and each morning is 1 unit. There are 2,300 of those evening morning units. So we say they are 2,300 evening mornings. Okay. So that's how we say mornings. But in the original language, it is 2,300 evening morning. We know these are not sacrifices. And the reason we know they're not sacrifices is because the evening and mornings are only designated for days. Morning and evenings are designated for sacrifices. And when you go through the Bible and you look at how the sacrifices were denominated or designated, you will always see that they are called morning and evening sacrifices. Daniel says the 2,300 day prophecy is actually 2,300 evenings and mornings, or evening mornings. Thus, we understand that it can't be talking about sacrifices. Okay. So now the question is, if it's not 2,300 sacrifices, then what are they? Well, if it's not 2,300 sacrifices, they have to be 2,300 days. And now that we've determined that it is 2,300 days, now we need to determine, when does the 2,300 days begin and when does the 2,300 days end? Now, if we can determine when it begins, we can have a better understanding of when it ends. I think that's just logically, it's logical to come to that conclusions. Okay. Now, before we determine the beginning of this vision, I need to make one thing clear to everyone that is watching this video. Okay. And this is important. Daniel chapter 8, you must understand that in Daniel chapter 8, it is not one vision. It is 2 visions.
What you talking about, Willis?
Now, I'm not just going to tell you that. I'm going to show you that from the scriptures themselves. I need you to understand that the vision that Daniel saw with the ram, the goat, the horns, and the little horn, all of that is the first vision that Daniel saw. Now, I also need you to understand that the vision of the 2,300 day evening mornings is the second vision that Daniel saw. Now, I want to make sure that I'm clear here. We understand that Daniel saw this vision in chapter 8 in one sitting. In other words, it's not like the angel came and gave Daniel the vision of the ram, the goat, and the horns, and then left, and then comes back and gives Daniel the vision of the 2,300 day evenings and mornings. It's one vision as far as time. Okay. Daniel was given this vision at the same time. Okay. But I need you to understand that the 2,300 day evening morning, 2,300 evening mornings is actually a second vision, or a separate vision than the ram, the goat, and the horns. We know this because in verse 26 of Daniel chapter 8, Daniel refers to the vision, or the 2,300 day prophecy. He refers to it as the vision of the evening and the morning. Now, did you catch that? He specifically calls it the vision of the evening and the morning. So even though we understand Daniel had this vision in one sitting, if I can call it that, the vision, he's separating the vision of the 2,300 day prophecy as its own vision. Now that we understand that the 2,300 evening mornings is its own separate vision, now that we understand that, in verse 27, when Daniel said, "I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it," he wasn't referring to the vision of the ram and the goat and the horns. He was referring to the vision of the 2,300 evening and mornings. In other words, he was astonished at the 2,300 days. Now, the question is, why was Daniel astonished? Why was he stunned at this vision of the 2,300 evening and mornings? Well, you must understand that when Gabriel gives Daniel the vision of the ram, the goat, and the horns, he then gives Daniel the interpretation of the ram, the goat, and the horns. We know this because we can see in verse 20, he interprets the ram as the kings of Medo-Persia. He interprets the goat as the king of Greece in verse number 21. In verse number 22, he interprets the 4 horns. And he even gives Daniel an interpretation of the little horn in verses 23 and 24. But ladies and gentlemen, what you must understand is that the angel never gives Daniel the interpretation of the cleansing of the sanctuary and the 2300 evening and morning prophecy. He never tells Daniel when the prophecy begins, and it doesn't tell Daniel when it's going to end. And thus Daniel is stunned. And the Bible says that Daniel even fainted because he wanted to understand this vision. And you also must see here, ladies and gentlemen, that the angel, not only does he not give Daniel the interpretation of the 2300 evening and morning prophecy or the cleansing of the sanctuary, not only does he not do that, but he also tells Daniel that the vision is shut up. And he confirms it by telling Daniel that it's going to be shut up for many days. Interestingly enough, the angel doesn't say the vision would be shut up for many sacrifices, as being alleged by some of our friends in the evangelical circles, but I digress. Ladies and gentlemen, you must see here that no one could understand this vision of the 2300 evening and mornings, not because it was hard to figure out, but because God set a seal upon it, or he shut up the vision so that no one was able to understand the vision of the 2300 evening and mornings. All right. Now, at this point, Daniel doesn't know anything about the 2300 day prophecy. He understands it has something to do with the sanctuary. He understands it has something to do with the justification or the cleansing of the sanctuary, but he doesn't know anything other than that. And he specifically doesn't know when the time period of the 2300 days begins or ends. Okay. So all he knows is that this vision has been shut up, or what I typically say, it's a sealing that's set upon it. Okay. Now, in my mind, I believe that Daniel thought, or he understood, the vision had something to do with the sanctuary. However, I don't think that Daniel understood that he truly didn't understand what this whole 2300 day prophecy was about. That's just my opinion. All right. However, what Daniel truly, because he believed it had something to do with Jerusalem, what Daniel really wanted to understand was the timing of the 2300 evening and mornings. Okay. So this is important to Daniel because during this time, the sanctuary in Jerusalem lay desolate. Remember, they're in captivity in Babylon. So there was no sanctuary. So the fact that the angel is telling Daniel about the sanctuary, it gives Daniel the impression that something is going to happen. We're about to go back home to Jerusalem, because the sanctuary, how can the sanctuary be justified if the sanctuary doesn't exist? It has to exist in order for it to be justified, giving Daniel the belief that, hey, we're about to go back to Jerusalem and the sanctuary is going to be justified. Okay. So that's, in my understanding, that's what Daniel thought. And I believe that is logical for Daniel to think that, right? Now, unbeknownst to Daniel, what he didn't understand is that he wouldn't hear back from Gabriel after this vision in Daniel chapter 8. He wouldn't hear back from Gabriel for approximately another 10 years. Now, I have a mini hypothesis as to why the angel took so long to come back. Okay. Now, I want you to think about this from Daniel's perspective. He believes that the 2300 evening and mornings, or the cleansing of the sanctuary, has something to do with Jerusalem here on earth. And what he doesn't understand is the timing, but he believes it's referring to something about Jerusalem. Now, the timing of the 2300 day evening and mornings is not been told to Daniel. In Daniel's mind, he assumes the 2300 evening and mornings begins at the time that Gabriel gave him the vision in Daniel chapter 8. That's around 550 BC. Now, if Gabriel would have came back, let's say 5 or 6 years later, because remember, if we take 2300 evening and mornings as 2300 days, and we calculate that as years, it's going to come out to about 6 years and probably a couple of months, right? So let's just say 6.25 years, okay? 6 years and 2 months, right? So if Gabriel would have came back and let's say 5 or 6 years later, Daniel probably would have thought, okay, the cleansing of the sanctuary is going to happen now because Gabriel's coming back, you know? So in God's wisdom, I believe that he had Gabriel come back long after this 6.5 year period ended. In other words, he's letting Daniel know that this 2300-day prophecy did not start at the time that Gabriel gave you the previous vision. All right. So, and we're gonna cover the timing of that. But just so you know, at the 6-year mark after Daniel chapter 8, Daniel realized, okay, the timing, I still don't have the timing because it would have happened right here at the 6-year mark. And that would probably be somewhere around 543 BC, maybe somewhere around 544, 543 BC, right? So the angel doesn't come back all the way until around 539 BC, approximately 10 years later, right? So Daniel now fully understands, he doesn't understand the time frame of this 2300 evening and morning prophecy, all right? Now, because he doesn't understand it, he is beginning to think that it has something to do with the 70-year prophecy. Now, don't confuse the 70-year prophecy with the 70-week prophecy that is later on in Daniel chapter 9. Essentially, the 70-year prophecy was prophesied over Israel because of their sins, and it prophesied how long they would be in captivity in the nation or the empire, the Babylonian Empire. Okay. So now Daniel is starting to study this prophecy because he's linking the idea of the 2300-day prophecy with the 70-year prophecy. And he's saying, okay, well, these two have to be related because the 2300-day prophecy is about the sanctuary, and the 70-year prophecy is about the releasing of Jerusalem from captivity. So that's how he is connecting both of these two prophecies together. So he's thinking that the 70-year prophecy is related to the 2300-day prophecy, or the 2300 evening and mornings. Okay, and we know he's doing this because Daniel chapter 9 begins by him trying to understand these calculations. And he's focused on the 70-year prophecy. Notice what it says in Daniel 9 verse 2. He says, "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem." Okay, so think about it. He's now trying to say, okay, the 2300-day prophecy. Okay, now he's looking at the 70-year prophecy and trying to make the connection that the 70-year prophecy is related to the 2300-day prophecy. So now Daniel begins to pray because he's trying to understand, but he believes that this sanctuary, the Jewish sanctuary, has something to do and is going to be restored. And so here he's praying to the angel to make sure that there's no delay, or he's trying to make sure, does the 2300-day justification have something to do with this, with the desolation of Jerusalem now, or the desolation of the sanctuary? And notice what he says in his prayer. He says, "Now therefore, O our God, hear the prayer of thy servant and his supplications, and cause thy face to shine upon thy sanctuary that is desolate, for the Lord's sake." So hopefully you can see what's happening here. It appears to be that Daniel is looking at the 2300 cleansing of the sanctuary, and he's probably placing the fulfillment of that prophecy with the fulfillment of the 70-year prophecy. In other words, he's probably thinking that they both end at the exact same time. I believe that when Daniel started this, the angel had to come back because Daniel is probably likely going to misinterpret this 2300 evening and morning, because remember, it's sealed. God dispatches Gabriel to make sure that Daniel doesn't make this mistake. Okay, so he dispatches Gabriel so that Gabriel can explain to Daniel that the 2300-day prophecy, the timing of the 2300-day prophecy, is not about the 70-year prophecy. Now, notice what happens when Gabriel comes and explains this to Daniel. Daniel says, "And he informed me and talked with me and said," and here's what Gabriel's saying. He says, "O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding." He continues, "At the beginning of thy supplication, the commandment came forth, and now I am come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore, understand the matter and consider the vision." Now, I want you to think about what the angel just told Daniel. He says, "I want you to consider the vision." What vision? Gabriel cannot be talking about the 70-year prophecy because that really wasn't a vision. It was just a prophecy. I haven't read anywhere where it's called a vision. Maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't read anywhere in scripture that the 70-year prophecy is called a 70-year vision. All right. So he can't be talking about the 70-year prophecy. Well, what about the conversation that he's having with Gabriel right now? Maybe he's talking about that, considering this vision that he's having right now. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is not designated as a vision by Daniel, for he says Gabriel was caused to fly swiftly to him. So he's not designated. He doesn't call it a vision. He simply calls it Gabriel talking to him, right? Or Gabriel flying swiftly to him. So he doesn't call that a vision. The vision that Daniel is talking about has to be a vision from Daniel chapter 8. That's why I began this study by telling you that in Daniel chapter 8, it is not one vision, it's two visions. Because people are going to try to tell you that the vision that the angel is trying to explain to Daniel in chapter 9 is related to the vision of the ram, the goat, and the horns. Ladies and gentlemen, the vision of the ram, the goat, and the horns, Daniel understood this long ago, all the way back in Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar had the dream. Daniel understood. Remember, he said, the head of gold is you. There will be a lesser kingdom after you, and another kingdom that shall bear rule over the whole earth. And then the kingdom of iron. He understood that the succession of kingdoms. He was there to see the handwriting on the wall. He understood the vision of the lion, the bear, and the leopard, and the terrible beast. God reiterated this same information to him over and over and over again. Gabriel is not coming to tell Daniel about the vision of the ram, the goats, and the horns. He's coming to tell Daniel the only vision that Daniel needed to understand was the vision of the 2300 evenings and mornings. It's the only vision that Daniel needed or didn't understand. It is the only vision that Daniel fainted about because he really wanted to understand and couldn't understand what it meant. It's the only vision that God told Daniel at this point that is sealed up and that he wouldn't be able to understand it. And so when the angel comes back in Daniel chapter 8, he had to be referring to the vision of the 2300 evenings and mornings. Now, remember, the vision of the 2300 evenings and mornings is sealed. So when Gabriel comes to explain to Daniel or to give him understanding, he can't tell Daniel what the 2300 day prophecy is about because the prophecy is sealed. The only thing he can tell Daniel about is the timing of the prophecy. Okay. And that's really what Daniel wanted to understand. He wanted to understand the timing because he thought it had something to do with the timing of them in Jerusalem right then and there, right? Or during their captivity in Babylon. And Gabriel is going to make sure that Daniel understands it has nothing to do with their captivity in Babylon. So what does Gabriel say? He doesn't start off by saying the 2300 day prophecy is about the sanctuary being cleansed in heaven. He doesn't say anything about the sanctuary 1844. He doesn't say anything about that. What he does is give Daniel another time prophecy. And notice what he says in verse number 24. He says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. The angel makes no mention of the 2300 evening mornings, but he mentions another time prophecy. Now, we should be questioning, we have to question, how does this time prophecy, how is it connected with the previous time prophecy? In other words, how are these 70 weeks connected to the 2300 evening mornings? Ladies and gentlemen, the connection comes with the word determined.
I don't think I follow.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to notice that the word determined is used 3 times in Daniel chapter 9. Once in verse 24, once in verse 26, and once in verse 27. Okay? They all use the word determined. But what I want you to understand is that determine in verses 26 and 27 is different from the word in verse number 24. Okay. Now, the word in verse 26 and 27 uses the words karatz. All right. Now, that means to decide. It means decreed or determined. Okay. That's essentially what it means. And that makes sense how they're utilizing here in verse 26 and 27. But that is not the word in verse number 24. In verse 24, the word determined in the Hebrew is kathak, and that means to cut off. So in essence, the 70 weeks were cut off for the children of Israel. Now, the question is, what were they cut off from? Now, I want you to think about this. When something is cut off, there is something that is left over, right? If I were to take an apple and cut off a piece of that apple, you must understand that there is something remaining from that apple. The rest of the apple is still there. And so there is a piece that is cut from the apple, but the apple is still there. So when the angel tells Daniel that 70 weeks are cut off, now we have to determine what is it cut off from, and that will help us to determine the timing of the 2300 evening mornings. Now, when we consider that the angel did not give Daniel the interpretation of the 2300-day prophecy, that Daniel did not know the meaning of the 2300 evening and mornings, when we take into account that the angel returns to Daniel to give him skill and understanding and to consider the vision of the 2300 evening and mornings, the only understanding that we can determine, the only interpretation that we can ascertain is that the 70-week prophecy was cut off from the 2300 evening and mornings. Thus, the 70-week prophecy and the 2300 evening and mornings, they begin at the exact same time. The 2300-day prophecy and the 70-week prophecy, they have the same starting period. And this is how we can determine the beginning of the 2300 evening and mornings. This is how we do it. Ellen White actually summarizes it better than I can. She says in The Great Controversy, the angel had been sent to Daniel for the express purpose of explaining to him the point which he had failed to understand in the vision of the 8th chapter, the statement relative to time. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. After bidding Daniel understand the matter and consider the vision, the very first words of the angel are, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. The word here translated determine literally signifies cut off. 70 weeks representing 490 years are declared by the angel to be cut off, as specifically pertaining to the Jews. But from what were they cut off? As the 2300 days was the only period of time mentioned in chapter 8, it must be the period from which the 70 weeks were cut off. The 70 weeks must therefore be a part of the 2300 days, and the two periods must begin together. So now we understand that the timing of the 2300-day evening and mornings is really what Daniel was seeking to understand. And the angel comes and gives Daniel a time prophecy, but this time prophecy is related to the 2300 evening and mornings. Now that we understand how we calculate the 2300 evening and mornings, and we understand that it begins the same time as the 70-week prophecy, now we need to go into the 70-week prophecy to determine when did the 70-week prophecy begin. Okay, so we're going to continue this series on timing the 2300-day prophecy. And our next week's study, we're going to delve into this idea of the 70-week prophecy and when did it begin. Okay, and hopefully we can begin to understand this 2300-day prophecy even clearer than what we understood it before. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Adventist Watchman, and now you understand how we Adventists understand and how we determine the calculation for the beginning of the 2300 evening mornings. God bless you.